More on the plane now, plus a breaking update on Ukraine. Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of California is joining me. He is a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Welcome. Nice to see you as always. So let's talk about the issue of the stolen passports here. Does this raise any red flags for you? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you start thinking down certain lines because of that?
Well, it certainly raises red flags, but I think it's far too early to make any conclusions about whether this is a likely terrorism act. I can tell you what the intelligence agencies are going to be doing right now is the Malaysian authorities have video footage of these two people traveling with those stolen passports. So we're going to be scouring those images. Do any of our talented analysts in our database, are they able to recognize the images of those? A lot will depend on what the quality of those images are. We're also going to be working with our international partners to scrutinize the passenger manifest. Are there any people on that plane traveling under their own passports that have any link to terrorism? But what I find shocking, Alex, is Interpol's statement, and I have no reason to believe this isn't true, that on a flight this size, it's not unusual to have two people traveling with false passports. That's a pretty astounding gap in security. DHS works in terms of flights originating or traveling to the United States to check with Interpol on stolen passports. But we're going to have to make sure that we've got a pretty airtight system here as well, and I don't know that that's the case.
Yeah, one passport getting on a flight, I think we all thought, okay, you can see how that might happen occasionally, but two was rather jaw-dropping. Let me just ask you this. If this was an act of terror, wouldn't somebody have claimed responsibility by now?
Well, that's, I think, another important indication that this may be a mechanical failure. It could be an issue with one of the pilots. So, you know, I still think that it's more plausible that it wasn't terrorism related than that it is. Probably the more routine explanation for the stolen passports is that these two people were smuggling drugs or some other contraband. That's far more likely the case, particularly when you consider how common, evidently, it is, according to Interpol, for people to be traveling with stolen passports. Okay.
Let's switch gears here. Turn to the situation in Ukraine. The newly appointed prime minister has said that he's coming to the U.S. this week. I'm actually looking at a press release from the White House. He will have a meeting with the president on March 12th now. They'll be discussing the standoff with Russia. Can any concrete actions come from his visit, or is this more symbolic?
Well, I think it's probably both. It's an important symbolic act, just as it was for Secretary Kerry to go to Kiev and go to the place where some of the protesters lost their lives. So, too, it confers legitimacy on this government to have the president meeting with this new leader in the Ukraine. So I think it's very important symbolically, but they'll also be talking about concrete steps. We want to make sure that Kiev doesn't take actions that will invite the Russians to go further into eastern Ukraine. We'll want to talk about increased security and military cooperation with Ukraine and, you know, try to fashion a strategy. It's going to have to be, it looks like, a midterm and long-term strategy because Putin gives no indication whatsoever that he's going to be backing away from annexing the Crimea. So I think we've got some long-term strategies to undertake, and that means sanctions, and that means economic pain for Russia and some pain for us and Europe as well.
Well, in terms of sanctions, let's look at Moscow's reported potential actions, because Russia now saying it would consider stopping the international inspections of its own nuclear weapons. That is if the U.S. imposes new sanctions. So put that in perspective. How big a deal is that?
Well, you know, it's significant that, you know, Russia is threatening to escalate in an area completely removed from the crisis in Ukraine. That could not only pose problems in terms of that treaty, and it would be a violation of that treaty, but could jeopardize the broader non-proliferation structure. At the same time, there are other threats to that non-proliferation structure because part of this Budapest memorandum that we've been talking about has been the fact that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, returned them to Russia in exchange for promises of territorial integrity that the U.S. and Britain and Russia would guarantee. So if we can't, in fact, guarantee that territorial integrity, then one incentive do others have to give up their nuclear programs. So there's a lot at stake. But, you know, I think nonetheless, even with this threats that they may escalate outside of this particular area, the U.S. is really going to have to move forward with sanctions in concert with our European partners.
What about the $1 billion in aid that the U.S. is offering to the Ukraine? That's an awful lot of money. Is that the best way to go about helping Ukraine?
It's part of, I think, a two-part approach to Ukraine's financial situation. Yes, they need the emergency assistance right now. It's very important. It's a pretty small drop in the bucket of Ukraine's problems, though. Those problems are probably upwards of $35 billion, so $1 billion is a very small down payment. Europe is stepping in with $15 billion more in its assistance. All of this, I think, is going to be important to stabilizing Ukraine. At the same time, another really important piece is going to be trying to diversify Ukraine's energy supply so that it can't be subject to this extortion by Russia. And Russia's going to turn up the heat there by forcing them to pay more for their natural gas or turning off the supply. So this is an important component of a two-part strategy.
All right, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff of California.